Hey, what's up, everybody? How you doing? This is your Coach Renz. What's up? This is your Coach Renz. We are streaming live both on YouTube and Facebook, and we are about to go live on our blog post at the Alchemy of Life blogradio.com/blog talk radio. And we gotta do our sharing. So how's everybody doing? Just let me know you come in. You know the first few.
Now, press 1 to hear.
You know the first few minutes. We gotta get some sharing.
Your show will go live in 5 seconds.
And listen to this lady talk.
3, 2, 1.
Get her bridge. What's up, Blog Talk Radio? One day I'm gonna not talk while the Blog Talk Radio lady is talking, and actually like cue that in like on time. But let me do some sharing over here. You guys can share as well. I greatly appreciate that. If I can get my life right here and press the right buttons. How's everybody doing tonight? How we doing? How we doing? Let me know who you are, where you at. You know, I always like to know who we talking to tonight. Some tried and trues. If you had listened to the show last week, we had a really good show. It was entertaining. It was a lot of good information that we talked about polygamy in the Black community, especially. So last week conversation discussing polygamy in the black as far as Black Americans are concerned, how that would benefit or if there's any issues, problems with it. So if you didn't see that show last week, you know, go back and check that out. Good evening. Who was that say? Good evening. Good evening, Shondell. How you doing, man? So if you didn't get a chance to check that out, go last week and check out the fact that we talked about polygamy, and you know, some of the additional conversations we had about that one was good conversation. People have had good commentary, and I like the fact that people were very polite. It's a good polite crowd. No one was like really rude or anything like that. We had differences of opinion, to which I'm sure tonight we're going to have some differences of opinion as well, taking a deeper esoteric look at the psychology of the writers of the Hebrew Bible. Understand, we're talking about the psychology of the writers. What were they possibly thinking? What was going on? We're not focusing on the validity of some of it. We are going to talk about that to a certain extent. In addition to it, as far as you know, who wrote it and why certain things are written, why there are certain differences and changes in each, you know, different changes and replications in stories, and why they have similarities to previous stories. So I hope you guys are ready for that. Just finishing up a little bit of sharing here. Hope you guys are sharing as well. All right, I just went ahead and just put my reading glasses on just to go ahead and get it started that way. You know, why even play around with it? All right, so we are about to kick this in. You know, I try to get this done within the first 3 to 5 minutes. See, that's definitely right now. And this one. Yep, that's it. That's all the sharing we're going to do. All right, so what's up, everybody? How you doing? Coach Renz. If you're finding me for the first time, you know, on this channel we talk about the 360 degrees of a person. We talk about love. We talk about sex. We talk about spirituality. We talk about religion. We talk about historical things as far as that. We talk about economics. We talk about everything. What's up, Papa? How you doing? We talk about everything under the sun because we want to get involved in the full 360 degrees of the person, of you, be able to really impact your entire life, my entire life, everybody's entire life, not just one aspect of life. So please keep comments, come in and comment about the subject. So tonight, as with last week, I said that tonight we was going to talk about, you know, last week I said, I kind of titled it as, what was it so much about the Hebrew story? You sent me a message on IG earlier. Okay, I'll go check that out. I'm learning IG. I'm getting better at IG. But we talked about what made this story so different. Let's look at historically with civilizations. If a country is conquered by another nation, then usually the people, the inhabitants, the ones who were conquered, would adapt the religion of the people who conquered them, or they would be absorbed into it. This is the whole idea of Hellenization, is the fact that they would come in and Hellenize in whoever they conquered. They would change their architecture to fit their architecture. They merged the religions together. They'd incorporate marriage in between the different societies, the conquered and the conquerors. They would merge, or they would just completely take over. We see that. We've seen that so many times throughout history. When you really study history, you'll see that when the Greeks came in and they took over an area, they made their gods the same as the other gods, and as whoever gods they had, and it became similarity. The Romans did it, but anytime any society, excuse me, any society would push their culture, their ideology on the newly conquered group. So when Japan conquered China, they pushed Japanese ways and Japanese culture, into the Chinese culture to force them to live as the Japanese does. We see that when colonization, when the Europeans, whatever country of Europeans went to another country, went to Africa or over to America or wherever they went, they imposed their will, their culture into that particular culture. And that's how it was. When the Aztecs would conquer, the Aztecs and Mayans would conquer other Central American, what we call Central America today, would conquer other tribes, then other nations, they would incorporate them into their grouping, into how they live. But one interesting thing happened about around 1000 BCE. And understand BCE, before the Common Era, CE, the Common Era. We are currently in the current Common Era, even though time is an illusion, time doesn't really exist. So I'm going to slouch forward so I can make sure I see you guys' comments. So what we're talking about is that in this time frame, this BCE, around 1000 BCE, roughly, you have a group that broke away from the Canaanites. They had a mixture of Sumerian, Egyptian, and Canaanite background in them. This group later became the Hebrew Israel people. They formed their own nation. After a while, around 500 BCE, around 700 BCE, they split. They broke apart from each other, forming the nations of Judah of 2 tribes and Israel of 10 tribes. I think I got that right. Yeah, 10 tribes. And they formed their own nation. They split, civil war. Out of this time frame, they still had a general consensus of an idea of how they view God, so to speak. And in viewing that, they still became conquered by other nations. But a doctrine was created, a way of thinking was created, that a lot of scholars try to separate them and say that it was new. But I'm going to show you guys how it wasn't new. It was just done in a way that made it very adaptable and very appealing to what would become the Romans, and how they would change the world by incorporating this newly formed religion with this 2.0 version of this religion that they started. And really back then, I doubt if the people who wrote it considered it a religion, moreover a historical way of life, more of a culture or a morality. So we're going to go through that. Now, some of this information is based off of a writer back in the 1930s by the name of Kaufman. Kaufman was a Israeli Jew. He was a Jewish scholar who, of course, every conquered people want to make themselves and make their people look great, and don't want to have attachments to the past or other groups. Want to separate themselves as to be something wholly new. If you saw a video I did a while back, I don't even remember what video it was, and I've talked about this multiple times, where there was a Chinese biologist, chemist, geneticist, let me get it right, a geneticist who wanted to prove that Chinese people were indigenous to China, that they didn't migrate from any place on the planet, right? But found out in his studies that Chinese people migrated from East Africa, more exactly from Ethiopia. Now, the thing about it is that he went into it with the intent of proving that Chinese people were indigenous, because he wanted Chinese people to be separate, to be different, to be something the world hasn't seen, that common science doesn't agree with, right? He wanted to prove that Chinese people were indigenous to China, that that's where they came from the beginning. But he proved that they came from Ethiopia. In the same way, Kaufman wanted to prove that the monotheism of Israel, of the Hebrew, was totally different from any other type of monotheism that had ever been created. That it was the first actual monotheism. And he went about it, but he had some holes in a lot of the things that he said. And like most people, he tried to force it. He tried to, for things that he couldn't actually get right, he had to try to force it. And we're going to look at some of those things he forced. But what's intrigued me the most about this is that he really is reteaching something old just in a different way and ascribing it to a people. But then over time, other writers change it and bring it really back to a polytheistic idea. If you really look at the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, you really see elements of a polytheistic idea, and you really see where it pulled from older other stories, other groupings, other countries, other cultures. So one of the first things that, in thinking about that, we should realize is that the Hebrew Bible, and I'm not calling the Old Testament on purpose because it's really not. When you're talking about the Hebrew Bible, when you're talking about what people call the Pentateuch, the Tanakh, that's the Hebrew Bible. If you went to Israel and you called the Hebrew Bible the Old Testament, you might get into a fight. Somebody might want to like throw some blows with you, right? So it's the Hebrew Bible, and that's why I'll keep referring to it in that format. But it's not a book. It's not one book, okay? It's not a book. A book is written generally by one author, or by, if it is written by multiple authors, they usually are all alive at the same time and collaborate to write the book. The word, the Bible is a library of books. It's multiple books written by multiple authors, and it's written over a large span of time. So the first thing that you have to set aside is any idea that this is a book, first of all, and that it was put together by a consensus of people at one time, that it was being written over a long period of time. Hey, how you doing? Hi, Colleen, Andre. So it was written over a longer period of time. And because it's written over a longer period of time, it's more accurate to look at it as more of a historical account of the psychology and the culture of a people during that particular time. When they were coming out of captivity in Babylon, they were writing as people coming out of that captivity. Ooh, we have some problems over here on YouTube. I don't know, it's not charging. I hope the YouTube feed don't die on us like that because I don't think it's charging as fast. That's not going to be a good thing if it dies over there on YouTube. If it dies on YouTube, I'll flip something and bring it back on a different way. So if YouTube pauses for a while, I apologize. We'll try to make it so that it doesn't. So anyhow, and we're going to go through this pretty. I'm not going to keep you guys long tonight. We're going to keep this real short. So where was I? Oh yeah. So it's not a book. It's not a book. It's a library written over people over a long period of time. So you have to recognize that this is how people were just thinking in a culture, and they were trying to relate the creation and God and all the other stories that they already knew and bring it to them. But it started out with one main idea. And I think that one main idea is the thing that has allowed it, unlike the Greek religion, that even though the Romans co-opted it and made it their own, they went from Zeus to Jupiter. You know, Zeus and Jupiter, the same dude, they just changed the name. Unlike how the Greeks, they merged different, Ptolemy, and other people to create Serapis. This wasn't they didn't do that. They did something very different, but similar. And let me go ahead and break down the first thing that they did different, but how they did it and what made it. What they did that was old, but it looked different. They made God a divinity that was above nature. They made God one supreme God. Now, the idea of one supreme God wasn't new. The Hindus have one supreme God. Even every other religion, every other ancient culture had one supreme God. In Ifa, there is one supreme God, which is older than the Hebrew. In the Sumerian, there was one supreme God. There was always one supreme God. Now, what happens over time is that one supreme God is described in nature and then those descriptions of nature become gods, or people who represented that aspect, they get deified, they get legendized first, and then they become legendary, and then they become gods. So what they did back then, what the writers of the J-text, and you have to understand that the J-text is the Judas text. Remember I said Israel was split into Judah and Israel. You had the J-text, and now down in Israel you had the Elohist, the Yahwist, and they had the E-text. And then later on you get your D-text and the P-text, the priestly, and the priestly also kind of wrote the D-text. They're kind of very similar. So you get the different texts that focused on different aspects of the Jewish life, and it wasn't really called Jewish, it's the Hebrew Israeli lifestyle culture. And you have to remember, realize that the northern kingdom hated the southern kingdom, the southern kingdom hated the northern kingdom. They fought against each other, which is why the stories you'll see one group is looking better than the other, or they hated the Egyptians because they were coming out of, they were warring against them. There's a cylinder seal that talks about around I think it's around 1300 BCE, that talks about how the Egyptian utterly destroyed the Israelites and the Hebrews. This is the one of the first time that title was ever mentioned, but is in an Egyptian cylinder seal. Stele. It's an Egyptian stele, not a cylinder seal, an Egyptian stele that says that. It's one of the first mentionings of this group. So they didn't like the Egyptians. So if you ever want to know why the Egyptians look so bad in what's called the Hebrew Bible and the Pentateuch, the Tanakh, is because they warred against these people. The Egyptians came in and conquered them, and the Egyptians say they utterly destroyed them. So if you're the writers and you've been defeated and oppressed and beaten, of course you make your enemy look bad. You make them look horrible. So that's why the Egyptians look bad. But that's also why sometimes the Judas look bad, because the Elohist is writing, right? So if you need, I want you guys to definitely go and study more about the difference between these texts, but I'm going to give you some differences as we go in this. So one of the first things I want you to understand is that the thought process for Kaufman, and this since 1930 has become a model that many doctrines have followed, is that, and I was actually literally taught this in school, that Judaism was the first monotheistic religion, when in truth it wasn't. See, Kaufman was saying that it's an impossibility that it doesn't fit for monotheism to come out of polytheism. And he argued that point, that monotheism is inherently different and is not a natural progression out of polytheism. But before that, the common thought process is that it did. Monotheism came out of polytheism because polytheism was around longer. But in truth, and then what I'm going to show you tonight is that actually it was monotheism that became polytheism, that then the Hebrews reinvigorated the monotheistic idea. Very simply, we can go back just as far as Akhenaten. Akhenaten went and said, okay, Egypt, we got to go back to our old ways. The old ways was the belief of one supreme deity, the Aten. And he represented the Aten with the sun, the S-U-N. So, and he did this for 17 years. And they hated him, and they killed him after 17 years. The marketers hated him, the priests hated him, the military hated him, because he took them back to a monotheism. Now, mind you, he said he was taking Egypt back to monotheistic ideas, right? So that in itself tells you that there was monotheism in Egypt before there was Ptah and Marduk and Ra and Heru and Asar. Before all of them, there was a monotheistic idea. There was a one supreme deity, and Akhenaten was bringing bringing them back to that. Now, so that's one. That's one proof. What's one thing of, and that's written on the walls in Egypt. So that's one method of monotheism was there long before there was a Hebrew or an Israelite or a Jew. So that's one. But even before that, and one of the main crooks of this whole video, and we're going to talk about this even more so next week, is the Hermetic view talks of one supreme consciousness, the all in all, that everything is of the all and from the all, but everything is not the all, that only the all is the all. And in the same way the all creates, so did every other religion build their creation stories. And Genesis creation story is one of the areas that we're going to stick in. That was one. So I want you to understand, there was the Hermetic view of one supreme divine intelligence that created everything from thought, not from of itself, which if you think about the biblical story of Genesis, God just creates. He just wills creation, right? And then there are waters above the waters. Now, in the Sumerian story, you had waters above the waters because what you had was Marduk. First, there was waters above the waters. You had a fresh water that was mixed in with the salt water, which the fresh water is Anu and the salt water is Tiamat. And then they separate. And in that separation, you get the waters above the waters, the firmament. And it was closed off so that the waters above wouldn't rain down and mix with the lower waters. Then Tiamat becomes a dragon. Marduk slays Tiamat. Out of the body of Tiamat, he creates the firmament, the land. And from creating the land, then all the other gods are then created. And then the guys get tired of working, and so they create man out of the blood of one of Tiamat's generals. And man is then created to be like a slave force, according to one of the Sumerian creation stories. You have a similar story in the Egyptian with Ptah, and this creation of the water. Ptah is water above the water and all that stuff. So you have that water above the water story already being told long before there was a story of Abraham, or anything known as these stories are 3,000 and 8,000 years old. So they're thousands of years prior to the Hebraic story. So of course they borrowed from them stories. Those stories were familiar. So when you're writing this new story, they incorporate what's familiar to the people to make sure. It's kind of like, I love the movie Scrooge that had Bill Murray in it, but it's a retelling in modern day. So the Hebraic story was a retelling of the Sumerian, Egyptian mixed in story, but for a modern day people. But the one thing they needed to do was make their God supreme, different, bigger, better, so that the people can say our God is bigger than your God. So even though we go through suffering, even though we go through conquering, even though we've been conquered by the Assyrians and the Hittites and the Egyptians and the Babylonians and everybody else, we got this God on our side. And of course, we're going to get into why they keep getting conquered just a little bit. So the second thing, so that's first. That's one of the things Kaufman is messing up on, because monotheism was there first, and it was there in the idea of a supreme deity that is not a nature-based deity, that is not controlled by nature. I'm going to get a little bit more into that as well. The second part, and this is where the part of the nature comes in, is that